Thank you very much, Johan. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, senior officials from government, I see many familiar faces in the room, all protocol observed. I'm thankful that I'm first up because I can speak at the level of generality and people who know much more about localization and supplier development on this platform will deal with some of the detail. No pressure, Henk and Ashley. But let me go straight into it, if I can get it to work. So I think this is quite important at a theoretical level. Professor Andreoni makes the point that there's no universally accepted definition of what industrial policy is. There isn't a 10 easy steps to industrialization, if we think that there are 10 easy steps to reindustrialization, or that this process is going to be easy, we're probably making a big mistake. But I think this point, which was made by UNCTAD and the ILO in 2016, is very important, that without intervention by government in employing targeted and selective policies to modify economic structure and boost economic dynamism, we won't get anywhere. And these academics make the point that in order to achieve sustainable economic growth, job creation, poverty reduction, participating in the technological revolution and global value chains, we will have to have a targeted industrial policy. In other words, therefore, our industrial policy has to be country and historic specific. And as we all know, and sorry to deal with this theory, but I think it's very important for any discussion about industrial policy. We have very deep-seated structural fault lines in the economy. We are resource dependent. Everybody knows, reliant on minerals energy complex, race-based inequality, unemployment, skills, the financialization of the economy, and premature deindustrialization, which, as George Meyer so eloquently pointed out earlier, actually might be the new normal for South Africa going forward. And the structural problems in the economy have persisted long into the transition. After 20 years, unfortunately, we've not even begun to dent those structural problems. And perhaps, and you know, here I'm straying into politics, but the first 10 years of the transition, we adopted a Washington consensus model of industrialization, and industrial policy, in fact, didn't even feature in the programs of government, and we undertook massive liberalization, deregulation, and so on and so forth. And it was only in 2007 and 2008 that we adopted the National Industrial Policy Framework and subsequent annual iterations of IPAP, which presupposes an optimal mix and match of policy and programs from a wide variety of options specific to country context. The point that I think we should make in circumstances where we don't have the luxury of a highly developed, highly sophisticated development state, we should be adopting cautious pragmatism and doing what's realistically possible and building a collaborative and conditional partnership with the private sector and labor Of course, the debate about white monopoly capitalism, that's an important debate, and I think there are elements of it which are worthy of debate, but there's not a single country anywhere at any time in the world economic history that has had a successful program of industrialization which has not had a collaborative relationship with the private sector and large global companies. Moving on, so the IPAP sets out, and I'm not going to deal with it in detail, a host of policy instruments from financing to procurement and so on and so forth, which are all time-bound and have clearly identified lead and supporting departments. Where have things worked? I think we have to say that our industrial policy is not working, with some exceptions. We are still deindustrializing as a country. Of course, we've had to undertake our industrial program in the face of enormous global headwinds. But the program has lacked policy coherence and alignment, and in fact there's massive fragmentation across government departments. When in doubt, government seems to create another department, another ministry, another entity. And we've had enormously difficulty in forging a close collaborative conditional arrangements with the private sector, and their massive domestic barriers. We all know about them: electricity, red tape, skills shortage, regulatory issues, and so on and so forth. So this brings me to, I think, the point for today. The two critical, probably most important levers in the South African industrial policy toolbox are an evolving system of industrial financing, incentives, and export support, including our Black Industrialist program, and an evolving system of public procurement and supplier development, which might become even more important in conditions of enormous fiscal constraint. And the critical question then for me are, what are the main components of the procurement lever in South Africa? What are their weaknesses? How can these be scaled up? And how are we implementing these programs? So just to go through them very, very briefly, first of all, designation and local procurement. We've designated 23 sectors, subsectors, and products for local procurement. I would say that this is an important but slightly blunt instrument of the state, and that supplier development is the critical policy lever in this space. And there have also been massive problems of securing compliance, building the capacity in the state to manage and leverage localization of procurement. The second one would be the National Industrial Participation Program and the Defense Industry Program, where everybody knows when the state procures from a global supplier above $10 million US, offsets are attracted, and the obligor must invest in our industrial development programs. Supplier development, and this is mainly through the state-owned companies, but also, of course, in the private sector as well. We mustn't forget that we give the automotive sector somewhere in the region of 13 billion rand a year on budget incentives and tax forgone. And so we've got important policy levers in that space as well, although there are constraints in terms of what we can do under the WTO regulations, which I'll speak about in a moment. And then there's the very important work that's being undertaken by the CSIR and the DST, one example of which is the Technology Localization and Implementation Unit, and Minister Davies spoke about some of the others. There's the national effort to support a buy local campaign, and then, of course, there are concessions and contracts of the type embodied in the REAP, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, where localization requirements are built in. Of course, in our context, all of this has to and must be supportive of transformation and black economic empowerment. So, the technology lever. I think we need to say that localization and supply development, which doesn't have as a conditional requirement building competitiveness, and I'm using that in the broad sense of the word, and perhaps the best measure of competitiveness is an ability of a manufacturing company to compete in a global market. There are other measures, but they are very difficult. Unless we build in conditionalities into our procurement, we run the risk of feather bedding companies with the procurement instrument. And one of the greatest dangers to industrial policy is that the state feather beds domestic manufacturers with incentives, with raising aggregate demand through procurement, and so on and so forth. The industry technology nexus, the minister spoke about this in some detail. A for the DTI, technology transfer, acquisition and diffusion, and then of course research and technology development as the key enablers of both incremental and disruptive innovation. And so the DST, as we heard, has very important instruments, but as the minister said, we've got to get scale. And unless we get scale, and scale including meaning supporting and building large black-owned industrial companies, then we will be fiddling at the margins of reindustrialization and using this tool for reindustrialization. I've got some key questions. Which sectors should we concentrate on in order to build globally competitive capabilities related to South Africa's resource endowment, our historical capabilities, and where we think we should build globally competitive capabilities? And industrial policy experts often say, take risks. If you do nothing because you are too cautious, you might not have any damage, but you won't get anywhere either. And the biggest problem in industrial policy in South Africa is that we are often very cautious about risks. Therefore, is the concentration on upstream mining, capital, equipment, aerospace and defense, beneficiation, downstream titanium and PGMs and fuel cells, where we should be putting all our forces? One of the criticisms of IPAP is we're trying to do too much. In South Africa's political context, if you ask me to take sector X off the IPAP because we want to concentrate on sector Y, I would probably tell you it's politically impossible. So therefore, we've got industrial policy by default, and that default is where we put big state resources, automotive, clothing and textile, and in the technology space, I think this is where we are playing. Which sectors require or demand less supplier development support? Technology is driven, for example, in the OEM sectors by in the automotive sector by global OEMs. Should we be putting any support there? I went to Toyota City in Nagoya last year, and the Toyota executives told us they had spent $6 billion on research and development on the fuel cell, the hydrogen Toyota vehicle, which my colleagues from the DST will correct me, is way bigger than I think the total expenditure in R&D in South Africa as a whole. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe even in the auto sector, our Nelson Mandela Bay initiative, where we're looking at composites, can play some role in composite localization in tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers to the automotive assemblers. I don't know, but these are important questions, in my opinion. What are the optimal institutional arrangements between the DST, the DTI, and the CSIR? How do we overcome this fragmentation? I'm retiring at the end of next year, so somebody else will have to be putting in 14 hours a day and weekends, but I think we've got to get into a situation where we better understand the institutional arrangements, including in relation to the IDC, without, of course, getting into these massively bureaucratic programs. And what are the forms of collaboration with the private sector? And my colleague Björn Gerrits, I hope, will support me. How do we ensure that there are better technology, there's better technology intensity in both the supply and the demand side instruments? The role of the SOCs. SOCs have a critical role to play. Chinese industrialization, by and large, was driven at least partially by big SOCs. They need to contribute in terms of procurement, strategic sourcing, building manufacturing capabilities, innovation and technology, and so on and so forth. But non-compliance, and I'm using the word non-compliance as a metaphor for something much worse than that. In rail, perhaps we've lost the biggest opportunity that we had for industrialization because of massive slippage, rent-seeking, and perhaps we should call it what it is. At my age, one can do this. Corruption is the biggest enemy of industrial policy. And unless we grapple with that tiger, we can have the best industrial policy in the world, and it won't take us anywhere. So, despite the constraints and the problems, we have made significant progress. There's growing appreciation of the procurement lever. There is a steady forward movement in relation to policy coherence. There's better compliance across government departments. We're strengthening the existing legislation, and I won't go through all of that with you in the interest of time. Those are all the sectors that we've designated. The question is this the optimal mix? Are we going to industrialize our country on the back of that? I suspect not. Then the NIP. This is a very big policy instrument. My colleagues from NIP are in the room. There's billions of offsets which we are struggling to meet, often because the legislation is weak and it's not, the offset requirements are not built into the tender, and therefore it's a post-adjudication issue, and we get massive non-compliance. We've got to make it a pre-adjudication criteria, and we've got to ensure that the obligations of the companies abroad that have supplied the state are being met in a way in which we set the terms and conditions for their investment as far as that can be done. Those are the sectors that we're concentrating on in NIP, and those are, in the interest of time, I won't deal with that. Those are some of the criteria applied for NIP. Now, the institutional linkages for NIP are internal, they are external. We deal with a range of institutions and organizations, and of course, SOCs. We are presently trying to scale up our NIP to make it a much stronger, aligned instrument with the rest of the procurement instruments. Again, I'm not going to deal with this. Proudly, South Africa went through a phase where it was a less than optimal institution. We've now got a new board in place, strong management, and we are doing the most important thing of all, which is attracting private sector companies back into the membership of Proudly South Africa, and we're hoping to ramp up and drive a national campaign, Buy Back South Africa. So, Johan, I'll be finished in 3 minutes. Going forward, we are going to have with the National Treasury, the department, DPME, I forget what it stands for, Monitoring and Evaluation. And in the presidency, we are looking at reviewing the entire triple PFA, which falls under the National Treasury, to build in much stronger localization requirements, as well as empowerment requirements and secure compliance, and hopefully enable supplier development in that process. As the Minister said, we've got to scale up the work with the DTI and the CSIR. We are working with the Auditor General to ensure that there is compliance, including in the SOCs. We are doing an impact analysis on the designations, localization and supplier development, and whether the reciprocal conditions which I've been talking about have been met. We are working with the National Treasury and Proudly South Africa on local content implementation and things like the procurement accord. And the Minister mentioned it this morning, and he's repeatedly said that while he occupies the seat that he does, he will not sign at the WTO the procurement protocols, which would take that important localization weapon away from the state, that industrial policy weapon away from the state. And then, of course, we're doing very, very important work in automotives, in clothing and textiles, working with the private sector to look at the supply chains. And just to give you an example, in clothing and textiles, there's suddenly a new dimension. Global retailers, as anybody would know who's been to a shopping mall, is now H&M and Zara. And so suddenly, in the clothing and textile space, you'll have global manufacturers in the retail space constituting a threat to our retailers. And so I've come across it a lot in the last 10 years. When the private sector senses a threat, that's the best time to talk to them about collaboration with the private sector. So we're doing a lot of work across the value chain, from textiles to apparel manufacturers to retail, to better understand the value chain and how we can support the localization. And the IDC, of course, has been central to some of this work. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much time.